Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with our next speaker. Frank Santiago is going to be from Corteva Agriscience, is going to be talking about best practices for effective weed control in ornamental landscape beds. And with that, I'll give you Frank.
Thank you, Jerry. As Jerry said, my name is Frank Santiago. I work for Corteva Agrisciences. Corteva is a result of the merger between Dow Agrisciences and DuPont, which happened about 2.5 years ago. Corteva spun off as a result of that merger as our own independent ag company, encompassing the ag portfolio from both. So I'm going to correct Jerry. It's not Corteva, it's Corteva. It's a long E, but I always pronounce it in Spanish in my head, as long as I don't keep going with the R. So it's Corteva. I cover the Pacific Northwest Territory, which includes 7 states, is what you see here, District number 1. So I cover about 14% of these United States. I relocated to the Pacific Northwest from Arizona, and I'm having to adjust to seeing leaves on the ground and knowing that the seasons are changing, because in Arizona, the only time that I knew that the seasons were changing is because the license plates would start changing color as we got snowbirds in. And looking at weeds, why worry about weeds? Well, for one, they're going to be aesthetically displeasing. It's also a threshold. Some people are okay with weeds. It also depends on where they're at. But one thing that weeds can do is they can harbor insects, pests, pathogens, viruses. They can cause injury, something like a puncture vine can be there. So how we're worrying about weeds, how do we control weeds? Well, to control weeds, we have to understand what kind of weeds we have, what their life cycle is, and see where we can interject a treatment where they're most vulnerable and where it's going to be most effective. Primarily, we're going to be looking at either a grass seaweed or a broadleaf weed, and that's either going to be a monocot or a dicot. Depends on how many cotyledons it has. If we're seeing 1 cotyledon, we know it's a grassy weed. If we see 2 cotyledons, we know it's a broadleaf weed. Understanding what weeds we have helps guide us to what tools we can use to control those weeds. What we're seeing here is a picture of a seedling. There's 2 cotyledons, so we know that this is a broadleaf weed. So when we look at herbicides, whether they're selective, non-selective, pre-emergent, post-emergence, knowing what kind of weed we have is what's going to help guide our treatment. In looking at specifically these broadleaf weeds, knowing that we have broadleaf weeds helps narrow then our product choices or the tactics that we're going to use. But it's also important to know what kind of weeds we have, because depending on the product, they could have a different rate to be effective. In looking at integrated pest management, we're going to do all these cultural pieces to try to control those weeds, but when we have to interject, we want to use as little chemical as possible. So in looking at our weeds here as clover, we're looking at black medic and oxalis. They're all pretty similar. They're all going to be basically in the same areas. But why it's important to know whether we have clover or oxalis is going back to using a tactic where we're going to use a pre-emergent treatment. For example, our Gallery SC or DF product is a broadleaf pre-emergent that has separate rates for all 3 of these weeds. So if you were dealing with just clover, our low rate of 16 ounces per acre would get you covered where. If it's oxalis, you're looking at the medium rate of 23 ounces per acre. But black medic, now you're going to need 31 ounces per acre. You're going to need the full rate. So if we misidentify the weeds that we're having problems with, those target weeds, if we misidentify black medic as clover and go at that 16 ounce per acre rate, we're not going to be satisfied with the performance. On the other hand, if we misidentify clover as black medic and go at the full 31 ounce rate, we're going to be spending money we don't need to spend. In addition to, we're not being good stewards of that product because we're using more than we actually need. Weed ID is going to be a big piece of controlling these weeds. I've got some resources here. So I use the UC IPM site, the Integrated Pest Management site for University of California. I'm a licensed PCA in California, And a big piece of being a PCA is just having the fundamental understanding of integrated pest management, doing the least amount of interjection that we need, and just using a full array of tools that are at our disposal. I have a picture here of weedalert.com where you can also identify weeds. I have a picture of our old weed guide. There's a website right at the bottom, the Corteva.us products.solutions, where you can actually download the new Corteva weed guide. And the bone that I have to pick with any of these, with the weed guides, is that they're going to have full, mature weeds. And that's really the best time to identify weeds, whether they're broadleaf or grassy weeds. The problem is that that's not the best time to control them. At that point, that ship's already sailed. So that's why I like using the UCIPM site, because it's going to have photos of any of those weeds that we're trying to identify as seedlings, and those intermediate states all the way up to fluorescence. So we can identify things when it's a good time to control them using that website. Well, how do we start identifying weeds? Well, we start looking, is it a grassy weed or a grassy weed or a broadleaf weed? Now we start looking at what's its life cycle. Where is it the most susceptible to treatment? So in looking at weeds, we're looking at annuals, whose life cycle takes less than a year. But even then we have to look at, is it a summer annual or is it a winter annual? And that's important to know. Summer annuals are going to germinate in the spring. They're going to mature by fall. So they're going to complete their life cycle in that span. Winter annuals are going to germinate in the fall, and they're going to mature by spring. When we look at a biannual, for example, wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace has a 2-year life cycle where we'll get germination, a rosette, overwinter, before we get to actual flowering. And the perennial, really it's anything that's going to have a life cycle of more than 2 years, but even then we can differentiate between simple or creeping. So an example of perennial here is going to be dandelions. So once we identify what kind of weed we have, and then also what kind of life cycle that weed has, we can start looking at some of the methods that we can use to control these weeds in those shrub beds. We're going to start off by looking at cultural methods to use. And looking at those cultural controls are some of the easiest things that we can do. Making sure that we have the right plants planted in those beds, that we're watering enough, that we're not watering too much, that there's plenty of sunlight, that it's the right plant in the right place. In looking at hand weeding as control, this is really a reactive strategy as opposed to being proactive in keeping those weeds down. So hand weeding is not going to be effective with certain weed problems. So take, for example, oxalis or creeping wood sorrel, any of those things where they're going to regrow from rhizomes. So we've hand weeded, now we have these plants that we have to get rid of. So we have these plants that we're going to take, but some of these plants can reroot or seed even after being pulled. So an example would be purslane or Bermuda grass. But it also costs a lot of money. It takes time to hand weed, and it can be very expensive, from hundreds to thousands per acre, depending on what it is that you're dealing with. Here is a picture of a nursery. This is actually in California, as I went out on a visit out there. And it's a beautiful nursery, but what you're seeing here is that they didn't get their pre-emergent applications down. Their cultural practices weren't exactly where they needed them to be. So as a result, they had weeds growing everywhere. When we create an area for plants to grow, we can't determine which plant will grow in there. All plants will want to grow in there. So what you're seeing here is this hand weeding piece is going through, and we're putting these weeds into those pots. And as they're moving those pots around to wherever they're disposing them of, it's just like a salt shaker. They're moving those around. Those seeds are coming off the bottom there. And now we have just spread these weed seeds everywhere. In looking at these pieces, really all we're trying to do is not complete this triangle. We've got our host, our pest, and our environment. As long as we can control one of those and not complete the triangle, we won't have an issue. We can have a successful host, we can have the pest, but as long as we don't have the environment that are conducive to the growth of that pest, we're going to be okay. And that's where things like mulch can come in. Mulch can be very effective in preventing seed germination if it's applied deep enough. And we're talking 3 inches minimum. And at 3 inches, we're going to insulate that ground enough that we're not going to provide the ideal conditions for those seeds to germinate. They can be beneficial in that they can add organic material to the soil over time, but mulch does have to be replaced or replenished. Mulch can also compact. The more we water it, the more we walk on it, we're going to start compacting that mulch, and just over time it's going to start decomposing, it'll start compacting, and what can happen is it can form a water resistant barrier, so that instead of the water running through and getting to the plant's roots, it's going to hit a barrier and then start running off. So anytime that we are replenishing mulch, it's important to take a hard rake and break that barrier so that water can get through. The other thing that we're also trying to do by getting rid of that water resistant barrier is keeping the mulch from being able to wash away. If we have a compacted area that water's going to hit there, it's going to start running off and it's going to take the mulch on top of it with it. In looking at an area, and this is around my development, what you'll see here is that at parts of the year, this mulch is deep enough on the way up to that fence, but at that fence post line, it's not deep enough to keep those weeds from germinating. So the result is we have all these weeds that are right in that board and showcasing exactly where that mulch was not deep enough to not provide that ideal environment for germination. Here's an example of mulch that got compacted, that formed that waterproof barrier, and as water came through, this is also kind of on an incline here, the water created a gully because it hit that barrier, started running down, and instead of soaking in, it washed all that mulch away. And what you'll see there is that that's exactly where those weeds are. Because we've removed that barrier to germination now. Now we have weeds. Now we're going to have to either go in there and hand weed those weeds or use a chemical solution like a post-emerge. We can also use weed cloth or landscape fabric. Here's an example here. What the weed cloth is actually doing, instead of removing that ideal environment for germination, what the weed cloth is going to do is physically keep the weeds from pushing through. Those weeds are still going to germinate underneath that fabric, and they're going to be trying to find a place to come out. So it's really important then that we have fabric that is sturdy and that doesn't tear easily and that it doesn't stretch. We also want to make sure that it's stapled correctly around all the edges, because like I said, we're not stopping those weeds from germinating. All we're trying to do is keep them from coming up. So those weeds are going to be growing underneath there, and they're going to look and see if they can find a hole to come out of. So here's an example of that, and this is actually not a weed fabric, but this is artificial turf with weed fabric underneath it. And what you see here is that the weed actually came through this artificial turf. So here's somebody who thought that they had the artificial turf, they wouldn't have to worry about weeds. Well, life will find a way. In looking at chemical control, specifically at pre-emergents, the way that pre-emergents work is by creating a chemical barrier in that germination zone of the soil that will work to act on either the root or the shoot of the seed once it germinates. So an application doesn't kill the seed, it kills the plant once it germinates. And these work by having to be in that germination zone of the soil. So we're going to make our application here, what you'll see on the slide, but we need to incorporate that product into that germination zone. That's where we use water water either to activate it in. We can lightly rake it in as well. Water is a preferred way. We're going to get the water in. We're going to get it into that germination zone. Once that seed starts to germinate and the shoot comes out or the root comes out, we're going to go to work on either the root or the shoot, and we're going to kill that plant before it gets a chance to come out of the soil. An example here, here's a cross section of turf. We've got our little diamonds here. Those are our weed seeds. This red line represents our application of pre-emergent. You'll see the water coming down and being incorporated or activated into that germination zone where those seeds are. And the result will be that when those seeds germinate, when the conditions become, environmental conditions become right for those seeds to germinate, and they do, they're going to die before they can emerge. So they're never going to come out. But because of how pre-emergence work, by having to be in that germination zone, we have to make sure that there's not any obstructions on that turf or on those landscape beds, that all the leaves are blown off, that there's no debris sitting there when we make these applications. Because what you'll see here in this illustration is that we have two bare spots there, and think of maybe some leaves being there or just something that didn't get moved when we made this application. We come through, we incorporate our product, but we have areas where we don't have that buffer because of obstruction sitting on that surface area. So what's going to happen in here? Remember, we're not changing the environment. We're not physically keeping the plants from going out. We're just going to kill those seeds when they germinate in that zone. So what's going to happen here is that those weeds are going to come up. And it isn't that we had a product failure, it is that we had a misapplication. You know, reasons to use a pre-emergent is to never see the weed. You never have to see the weed. The other piece is that we're going to eliminate weed before they ever go to seed. And that means that we're going to start reducing the seed bank in that treatment zone. Just because you don't see weeds in an area any one time doesn't mean that those seeds aren't there. They're just waiting to come up to the germination zone so that they can germinate when conditions are right. By using pre-emergence, we're going to start reducing that seed bank because we're not going to let new weeds come in and add to it. The other piece is that we're going to avoid spraying post herbicides when it's going to be difficult or when it's going to be dangerous. If we're looking at landscape beds, and we've done all our cultural practices, we have used mulch, we've used landscape screen, but we're still having issues with weeds. It's looking at when those weeds come up post, it's either we're going to have to hand weed them or we're going to have to use the post emergent. And at that point, it can be very dangerous we have to be very careful that we don't overspray that product and affect the desirable plants. So using a pre-emergent is going to help us avoid using post herbicides when it's going to be difficult or dangerous. Here's an example of a median. Here's an example of a median. This was in California, and what you see here is on the left, this is the same median, but what you see on the left is that all these weeds came in between those desirable plants. They missed their pre-emergent application. Now we have all these weeds growing in there, and they decided to go in with Roundup as a post control. So not only did we have to be extra careful in making sure that we didn't get that Roundup on those other plants, now we have all these dead and dying weeds in that same medium. So how much better does the dead dying weeds look than the green weeds? You know, I would say not much better. So now we're going to have to come back up and pick up all those dead plants and dispose of them anyways. So in looking at having to be out there twice now to spray both the post-emergent and not having to pick up those dead plants, one application of a pre-emergent would have kept any of that from happening. So the top reasons to use a pre-emergent is because they are going to save you time and they're going to save you money. Things to keep in mind when thinking about herbicides, specifically pre-emergence, is that you're going to be using them around desirable plants. And that means that plant safety and versatility should be top of mind. And looking at an example, so I'm going to share with you the process that Corteva uses to add ornamental plants to our labels, and that means that it's going to be safe around or over the top on these plants. So the process is a 2-year process. It's replicated 2 times, 2 different locations, 2 times in California, 2 times in Florida. And what we see here is, for example, we've had sedum, spurium that we wanted to look at adding to the labels. So on day 1, these plants are sprayed with a 2x rate of whatever product we're testing. So in this case, it was gallery dimension and then a mixed gallery dimension. So on day 1, they get a 2x rate. 30 days out, they get another 2x rate. So in the course of 1 month, they've gotten a 4x rate application of our products. 60 days out, we'll come through and look at the effect that those products have had on those plants. And we rate them on a scale between 0 and 10. And at a 3, our nursery partners have said that that plant is still marketable and sellable. Anything above a 3, they would not consider marketable or sellable. So we've set our bar at a 3. Anything that's rated at a 3 or below is added to the label. Anything at 4 or above is not added to our label. So what you see here in this example is that on your screen left, you'll see the dimension was rated as a 5. So it's not dead or dying, it's stunted, but it was rated at a 5, so that sedum will not go on the dimension label. What you're seeing right next to it is a dimension gallery mix that was rated at a 4. Doing better than that 5, but it still wouldn't be added to the label. And what you're seeing here right in the middle is that gallery was rated at a 1.5. And you can see the entry to the immediate right. So the gallery was rated at a 1.5. So pending the result of the trials, as they're replicated, if they come in below a 3, if they keep being at the 1.5, then sedum would be added to the gallery label. So think about this process, the time that we've invested in this, going on over 2 years, and now look at just the sheer number of ornamentals that are listed on the product labels. So looking at Snapshot, which is our granular product, we're looking at 635 field-grown ornamentals, 487 container-grown. Just for gallery, you're looking at 714 field-grown and 562 container-grown. And what this means for you is that we've already done that work. You don't have to worry about, is this product going to be safe on these plants? We've already done that work. But it's not just, is it going to be safe on these plants? Is it going to control what I need it to control? And that's where looking at this breadth of control can come in. And I've got examples of not just our products, but competitor products, so that you can look at those labels. And it really depends on what weed it is that you're having the most issue with, whether they're grassy weeds or broadleaf weeds. If it's just broadleaf weeds, just gallery by itself controls 95 different weeds. If you have some grassy weeds, that's where something like Snapshot can come in, or dimension or gallery dimension mix, or even a barricade or Marengo. But in looking at, like I said, the plant safety and versatility, just the sheer number of plants that are on there, but then also looking at that weed spectrum. We have our Snapshot, which is a pre-emergent herbicide specifically for landscape beds. It controls 125 different weeds, and it has 636 ornamentals on the label. It can go anywhere between 100 to 200 pounds per acre. It's non-staining, it's odorless, it won't burn plants, it's very gentle to plants. In fact, it's used extensively in nursery markets. In looking at our Gallery SC product, it's a liquid product, like I said, 4 broadleaf weeds, 96 different weeds on it, 714 ornamentals, many of them just over the top. We're getting to a point in time where these landscape bed shrubs are going to be losing their leaves. So it's going to be the time to make these pre-emergent applications sometime before they start to bud. The incorporation time, I'll go back to this. The incorporation time on Snapshot, all pre-emergents will have an incorporation timeline. Some are immediate, some can be as long as a month. In looking at Snapshot, this has a 3-day incorporation time, so you have to make sure that you get at least a half inch of water on it within 3 days. With Gallery, we can extend that up to 3 weeks. We can have a 3-week window where we can get a half inch of water on it so that we can incorporate it into that germination zone. With our Dimension product, it's unique in that it's not a DNA, so it's not like pendimethalin or any of the other DNA products. It's in a related family. So that means that it's, as you can see here, it's colorless. It's not odorless, but it's colorless. And Dimension has about a 4-week incorporation time frame. What you see here is an example of a DNA. Now, obviously, this is back in Arizona, but what you see here is this orange color. All DNAs are either going to be orange or they're going to be yellow. And what you'll see is that there'll be some staining, especially as we get into those areas that we don't want to treat, but they'll have that staining there. The difference between, and what you're seeing here is a tank with the pre-emergent in it. But what the difference between Dimension is that it's not a DNA, so it's clear, it doesn't stain. And what you're seeing here is a Dimension Gallery tank mix, and even if you go up on that sidewalk, it's not going to stain. It's unique in that it has early post control of crabgrass as well, and up until the 3-tiller stage, and actually the further south and east you go, the more tillers it'll go to. In the Pacific Northwest, it's rated to about a tiller, where other pre-emergents are going to stop at pre-emergence. Dimension is going to give you an additional 2 to 8 weeks of control for crabgrass. I'm excited to talk about this new product that we have, and this product is called Crew. And Crew is a mix of both our Gallery and Dimension product. And it is labeled for both turf and landscape. So you have season-long control of 45 plus grassy weeds and small seeded broadleaf weeds, and then the 95 broadleaf weeds that Gallery controls. And they're both together in this granular product known as Crew. It comes in either 50-pound bags or 10-pound bags. It's got a low odor formula. It's dust-free. It's a very small prill. So the biggest challenge that people have with Crew is that they have to calibrate their equipment. It's probably about half to a quarter of the size of a prill of Snapshot. So you just can't go off of what you traditionally would do. You would have to calibrate your equipment to make sure that you're getting the proper dose down. So it's also non-staining. It's labeled for commercial turf grass as well as landscape ornamentals. So it can really go from border to border in the residential area, or it can do the same for park areas. With that, I'm right at my allotted time, and I have some time for questions if there's anything in the chat, Jerry.
Actually,
yeah, we had, Yeah, I get to pester you with questions, Frank. Do you know how well herbicides containing citrus oil work for post-emergent weed control? Avenger is one trade name that has the active ingredient D-limonene, I'm probably saying that wrong, citrus oil.
You know, citrus oils work, like I said, in looking at either, when you're talking about post-emerge products, you're either looking at selective or non-selective products. I believe most oils are going to be non-selective, so you have to be very, very careful with them. I don't know about that product specifically, but most organic herbicides are going to be some kind of contact herbicide. So they're only going to kill or burn the part of the plant that they land on. So it's very important to get both complete coverage of that target weed in order to be effective. If we just get it on half of it or some of the leaves, or we're not calibrating even that product correctly, we're not going to get very good results.
Someone's asking to see the UC integrated pest management site again.
Sure, and if you just Google UC IPM, it'll bring that site up. And I don't want to make you dizzy here. I want to go quick.
And while you're finding that, the last one I'll pester you about is what works best for clover?
For clover, on a pre-emerge scale, we're looking at, for our product specifically, it's going to be Gallery. Gallery is a great product on clover. It takes a very low use rate. With Gallery specifically, it's at 16 pounds per acre rate. It's just like I said, making sure that we're identifying the correct target weed, that we don't misidentify clover as black medic, because when we use the rate for clover, but we actually have black medic, we're not going to be happy with that performance. Any broadleaf pre-emerge product will control clover. Like I said, I have experience with Gallery, and I can tell you that Gallery does an excellent job on clover.
Okay, Frank, thank you very much. Let's go